Welcome to this journey of one of the most disturbing cases in recorded history, New Hampshire. Before we begin, I invite you to leave a comment about where you're watching from and the exact time you heard this story. We're interested in knowing where and at what times of day or night these documented accounts arrive. In the winter of 1921, the remote township of Franconia, nestled in the White Mountains of New Hampshire, became the center of what would later be whispered about as one of the most unsettling family mysteries in New England's documented history. The Ashford family had lived in relative isolation for nearly 2 decades along the old logging road that wound its way through the dense pine forests, approximately 8 miles from the nearest neighbor. Their property, a sprawling homestead built in the 1880s, sat at the base of Mount Lafayette, where the morning mist would roll down the mountainside and settle in the valleys for hours at a time. Thomas Ashford, 63 years old, had inherited the property from his father's estate and had spent most of his adult life working the land alongside his wife, Margaret, 58, and their 3 adult sons, William, 35, Edward, 32, and Henry, 29. The family had built a reputation in the sparse community for their self-sufficiency and their tendency to keep to themselves. Local records from the Franconia Township Registry indicate that the Ashfords rarely ventured into town except for essential supplies, and when they did, they conducted their business quickly and without much conversation. The first indication that something was amiss came in February of 1921, when the weekly mail carrier, a man named Samuel Porter, who had served the route for 15 years, noticed that the family's mailbox had not been emptied for 3 consecutive weeks. Porter later testified to local authorities that he had become concerned because the Ashfords, despite their reclusive nature, were meticulous about collecting their mail, which consisted primarily of seed catalogs and occasional correspondence from relatives in Massachusetts. On February 18, 1921, Porter made the decision to venture up the long, snow-covered drive to the Ashford homestead. What he discovered would launch an investigation that, according to archived documents from the New Hampshire State Police, remained officially open until 1958, when the case files were transferred to the state archives and classified as cold. The property appeared abandoned. Snow had accumulated against the front door to a height that suggested no one had entered or exited the house for weeks. The barn, which typically housed the family's livestock, was eerily silent. Porter later described the scene as unnatural, noting that even the usual sounds of the forest seemed muted in the immediate vicinity of the house. When he called out, his voice seemed to be absorbed by the snow and surrounding pines without the typical echo that one would expect in such terrain. Porter returned to town and reported his concerns to the local constable, a man named Deputy Marshal Frank Richardson. Richardson, who had known the Ashford family peripherally for years, initially suspected that they might have traveled to visit relatives for an extended period, though he acknowledged that such behavior would be unusual for the family, who had never been known to leave their property for more than a day or 2 at a time. Before February of 1921, the Ashford family had maintained what could be described as a routine existence that rarely varied from season to season. Thomas Ashford had been a methodical man, according to neighbors who lived within a 10-mile radius. He kept detailed records of weather patterns, crop yields, and livestock health in a series of leather-bound journals that he had maintained since taking over the property in 1902. Margaret Ashford was known for her skill with herbal remedies and often provided assistance to neighboring families during times of illness, though she always insisted on payment in goods rather than currency. The 3 sons had divided the responsibilities of the homestead among themselves with military precision. William, the eldest, handled the livestock and maintained the outbuildings. Edward managed the agricultural aspects of the property, including a substantial vegetable garden that provided most of the family's food throughout the year. Henry, the youngest, was responsible for hunting and fishing, skills that supplemented the family's diet and provided furs that Margaret would trade in town for items they could not produce themselves. Local records indicate that the family had achieved an almost complete level of self-sufficiency by 1920. They generated their own electricity using a water wheel system that Henry had constructed along the stream that ran through their property. They maintained their own livestock, grew their own food, and even distilled their own cleaning products from plants that grew wild on their land. This independence meant that they had very little need for contact with the outside world, which made Porter's observation about the uncollected mail all the more significant. The house itself was a testament to the family's industrious nature. Built originally as a simple farmhouse, it had been expanded over the years to include additional rooms, a root cellar that could store food for months at a time, and a workshop where the family crafted their own tools and furniture. The property also included several outbuildings, a smokehouse, a grain storage facility, and a large barn that housed not only livestock, but also served as a workshop for larger projects. Neighbors who had occasionally encountered members of the Ashford family described them as polite but distant. They were not unfriendly, but they seemed to prefer their own company to that of outsiders. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, who lived approximately 6 miles south of the Ashford property, later told investigators that she had always found the family to be somewhat peculiar, though she could never articulate exactly what made her feel that way. The transformation of this stable, predictable existence began, according to reconstruction of events, in late December of 1920. The trigger appears to have been the arrival of an unexpected visitor, though the identity of this person remains unclear even in archived records. What is known comes from a fragmentary journal entry found months later, written in Thomas Ashford's distinctive handwriting. December 28th, visitor arrived after dark, claims to be from Boston. Business concerning father's estate. Have provided accommodation for the night. Must discuss matters privately. This journal entry, discovered during the initial investigation in March of 1921, was the last dated entry in Thomas Ashford's records. The journal, which had been maintained daily for nearly 20 years, simply stopped. No explanation was ever found for this sudden cessation of what had been a lifelong habit. The visitor's arrival seems to have coincided with a series of subtle but significant changes in the family's behavior patterns. Samuel Porter later recalled that during his mail deliveries in early January 1921, he had noticed that the family's routine had altered. Previously, when he arrived at the mailbox each Thursday morning, he would typically see signs of activity around the property. Smoke from the chimney, movement in the barn area, or one of the family members working outside. Beginning in early January, however, the property appeared quiet during his visits, though he could still see smoke from the chimney, indicating that the house was occupied. Mrs. Hartwell reported that she had encountered Edward Ashford at the general store in nearby Bethlehem on January 15, 1921. She described his behavior as agitated and mentioned that he kept looking over his shoulder as if he expected to be followed. When she attempted to make conversation, asking about his family's well-being, Edward had responded with uncharacteristic brevity, stating only that everyone was fine and that they were dealing with some family business that required privacy. The storekeeper, a man named Charles Whitman, corroborated Mrs. Hartwell's account. Whitman later told investigators that Edward had purchased an unusually large quantity of supplies, including several weeks' worth of non-perishable food items, and an amount of kerosene that seemed excessive even for a family living in such a remote location. Most notably, Edward had paid for these supplies in cash, which was unusual since the Ashford family typically traded goods for what they needed. During this same visit, according to Whitman's testimony, Edward had asked whether anyone had been in the store asking questions about the Ashford family. When Whitman assured him that no such inquiries had been made, Edward had seemed to relax somewhat, but he continued to glance nervously toward the store's windows throughout the transaction. The last confirmed sighting of any member of the Ashford family occurred on January 27, 1921, when Henry was observed by a traveling merchant named Joseph Kellum. Kellum, who sold hardware and tools to rural families throughout the region, had been making his way along the mountain roads when he encountered Henry, walking along the logging road about 2 miles from the Ashford property. Kellum later described the encounter as brief but unsettling. According to Kellum's statement to investigators, Henry had appeared to be in a state of distress. His clothes were disheveled, and he seemed to have difficulty focusing on the conversation. When Kellum asked if he needed assistance, Henry had replied that he was simply going for a walk to clear his head, but he kept turning to look back toward his family's property as if something there was causing him concern. Most significantly, Henry had asked Kellum whether he had seen anyone else on the roads that day, particularly anyone who might have been traveling toward the Ashford property. When Kellum replied that he had seen no other travelers, Henry had seemed relieved, but also disappointed, as if he had been hoping for a different answer. The two men parted ways, with Henry continuing his walk away from the property and Kellum proceeding toward the town of Littleton. The local authorities initially treated the Ashford family's disappearance as a missing persons case, though the lack of any signs of struggle or forced entry made it difficult to determine what type of investigation was warranted. Deputy Marshal Richardson organized a search of the property that began on February 22, 1921. The search team consisted of Richardson himself, 2 volunteers from the town, and a tracker named David Mills, who had experience in finding lost persons in the mountain wilderness. The house was found to be in perfect order, with no signs of violence or hasty departure. Meals had been prepared and left on the kitchen table, though the food had long since spoiled. Personal belongings remained in their usual places, and there was no indication that the family had packed for travel. The beds appeared to have been slept in, but it was impossible to determine when they had last been occupied. Most puzzling was the discovery that the family's winter coats remained hanging in the hallway closet. Given the harsh February weather in the White Mountains, it seemed impossible that the family would have left the property without adequate clothing, yet there was no evidence that they had taken alternative winter garments with them. The livestock in the barn had perished from lack of care, suggesting that they had been without attention for several weeks. However, the barn itself contained evidence that someone had attempted to care for the animals for at least some time after the family's disappearance began. Fresh hay had been placed in the stalls, though not in sufficient quantities to sustain the animals, and water troughs showed evidence of being refilled sporadically. In Thomas Ashford's workshop, investigators found evidence of recent activity that seemed inconsistent with the family's normal routines. Several tools were missing from their usual locations, and sawdust on the floors suggested that woodworking had taken place recently. Most intriguingly, investigators discovered traces of what appeared to be fresh lumber that had been cut and shaped, though no completed project could be found that would account for this activity. The community's initial response to the Ashford family's disappearance was a mixture of concern and speculation. Given the family's reclusive nature, some residents suggested that they had simply decided to relocate without informing anyone, possibly to avoid some kind of financial obligation or legal difficulty. Others theorized that they had fallen victim to an accident while traveling, perhaps becoming lost in the wilderness during a sudden storm. However, a more troubling theory began to emerge among those who had known the family best. Several residents recalled that Thomas Ashford's father, who had originally built the homestead, had been involved in some kind of business dispute in the 1890s that had never been fully resolved. The details of this dispute were vague, passed down through local gossip rather than official records, but it seemed to involve questions about the legal ownership of certain portions of the Ashford property. Mrs. Hartwell, who had lived in the area longer than most other residents, remembered hearing stories about Thomas's father having been forced to pay substantial sums of money to settle claims against the property. These payments had allegedly continued for years, even after the elder Ashford's death in 1901, with Thomas taking over the responsibility of maintaining these arrangements. The visitor, who had arrived in December of 1920, according to this emerging theory, might have been connected to these old financial obligations. Some residents speculated that the family had been forced to flee in order to avoid some kind of legal consequence related to these historical debts. Others suggested that they had been coerced into leaving by individuals who had some claim on the property or the family's assets. As the weeks passed without any trace of the Ashford family, the official investigation began to expand beyond a simple missing persons case. Deputy Marshal Richardson contacted the New Hampshire State Police, requesting assistance from investigators with experience in more complex cases. In March of 1921, Detective Sergeant Robert Hayes arrived in Franconia to take over the investigation. Hayes brought a more systematic approach to the case. He conducted detailed interviews with everyone who had known the family, however peripherally, and he arranged for a more thorough search of the property and surrounding wilderness. It was during this expanded investigation that several disturbing discoveries were made that would transform the case from a missing persons investigation into something far more sinister. The first of these discoveries occurred in the basement of the Ashford house, which had not been thoroughly examined during the initial search. Hayes and his team found evidence that the basement had been used recently for purposes that were not immediately clear. The floor showed signs of having been disturbed, with loose soil that appeared to have been moved and replaced. When this soil was carefully excavated, investigators found a collection of personal items that seemed to have been deliberately buried. These items included pieces of clothing that did not belong to any member of the Ashford family, a pocket watch engraved with initials that did not match any known family members, and, most disturbing, several documents that appeared to be legal papers related to property ownership. The documents were damaged by moisture and difficult to read, but they seemed to contain information about disputed land boundaries and financial obligations dating back to the 1890s. Detective Hayes also ordered a search of the outbuildings that had not been thoroughly examined during the initial investigation. In the grain storage facility, investigators found evidence that someone had been living there recently, possibly for an extended period. A makeshift sleeping area had been constructed in one corner, and there were signs that meals had been prepared and consumed in this location. Most significantly, investigators found fragments of correspondence that appeared to be communications between unknown parties about the Ashford family and their property. These letter fragments, while incomplete and water-damaged, contained references to settlement of old business and final resolution of outstanding claims. One fragment mentioned a deadline of end of January and warned of consequences for continued non-compliance. Another fragment referred to the Boston arrangement and suggested that payment in full was required to avoid alternative measures. The handwriting on these documents did not match that of any member of the Ashford family, leading investigators to conclude that they had been written by the mysterious visitor who had arrived in December of 1920. The fact that these documents had been left behind suggested either a hasty departure or a deliberate attempt to leave evidence of what had transpired. As Detective Hayes continued his investigation, he began to uncover evidence of a conspiracy that extended far beyond the boundaries of the Ashford property. His inquiries in Boston revealed the existence of a legal firm that had been involved in property disputes throughout New England for several decades. The firm, Whitmore and Associates, had a reputation for aggressive collection practices and was known to pursue claims for years or even decades until they were resolved to their satisfaction. Records from Whitmore and Associates, obtained through legal channels, revealed that the Ashford family had indeed been involved in ongoing legal disputes related to their property. Thomas's father had apparently entered into a complex financial arrangement in the 1890s that involved using the property as collateral for a series of loans. When he had been unable to meet the terms of repayment, the family had been forced into an agreement that required regular payments to maintain ownership of their land. According to these records, the payments had been maintained faithfully until late 1920, when they had suddenly ceased. The legal firm had sent representatives to collect the overdue amounts, and when these efforts had been unsuccessful, they had initiated what they described as alternative collection procedures. Detective Hayes's investigation revealed that Whitmore and associates had been involved in similar cases throughout New England, often targeting isolated rural families who had limited means to defend themselves legally. The firm's methods were technically legal but ethically questionable, involving the use of intimidation and pressure tactics to force families into abandoning properties rather than continue fighting lengthy legal battles they could not afford. The pattern that emerged suggested that the Ashford family had been systematically pressured to abandon their property through a campaign of psychological intimidation. The mysterious visitor who had arrived in December of 1920 was likely a representative of the legal firm, sent to deliver an ultimatum regarding the family's financial obligations. Evidence found in the grain storage building suggested that this representative had been monitoring the family's activities and possibly threatening them with serious consequences if they continued to refuse to comply with the firm's demands. The makeshift living quarters indicated that the surveillance had continued for weeks, creating a climate of fear and paranoia that had ultimately driven the family to flee their home. However, Detective Hayes's investigation also uncovered evidence that the situation had escalated beyond simple intimidation. Among the documents found buried in the basement were what appeared to be witness statements describing incidents of property damage, threats of violence, and other forms of harassment that had occurred during January of 1921. One particularly disturbing document written in Margaret Ashford's handwriting described an incident in which the family had awakened to find that someone had been inside their house during the night. Nothing had been stolen, but personal items had been moved and rearranged in ways that made it clear that their privacy had been violated. The document also mentioned that the family's livestock had been found dead on several occasions, apparently poisoned, though no evidence of the specific cause had been preserved. Another document, apparently written by William Ashford, described a confrontation that had occurred in late January between the family and their unwanted visitor. According to this account, the representative from the legal firm had become increasingly aggressive in his demands, eventually threatening that the family would face serious consequences if they did not vacate the property immediately. The document suggested that this threat had been accompanied by implications of physical harm. Most disturbing of all was a partial letter found in Edward Ashford's handwriting that appeared to be addressed to relatives in Massachusetts. The letter described the family's growing fear and their belief that they were being watched constantly. It also mentioned that they had begun making preparations to leave the property, but that they were afraid to do so because they believed their movements were being monitored and that they might be followed. The letter broke off incomplete, as if Edward had been interrupted while writing it or had decided not to send it. The date on the letter was January 30th, 1921, which would have been only a few days before the family's disappearance was discovered. As Detective Hayes pieced together the evidence, a clear timeline began to emerge. The mysterious visitor had arrived in December of 1920 with demands for immediate payment of long outstanding debts related to the property. When the family had been unable or unwilling to comply, a campaign of intimidation had begun that had escalated throughout January of 1921. The family had apparently attempted to resist these pressures for several weeks, but by late January, their situation had become untenable. Faced with threats of violence and ongoing harassment, they had made the decision to abandon their property and flee to safety, though where they had gone, remained unknown. However, the investigation also revealed troubling gaps in this narrative. If the family had simply fled to escape their tormentors, why had they left behind all of their winter clothing? Why had there been no subsequent contact with relatives or friends who might have been able to assist them? And most puzzling of all, why had no trace of them been found, despite extensive searches of the surrounding wilderness? Detective Hayes began to explore the possibility that the family's disappearance had not been voluntary. The evidence of escalating threats and harassment suggested that their situation had become increasingly dangerous in the weeks leading up to their disappearance. It was possible that their attempt to leave the property had been intercepted, or that they had been prevented from reaching safety by those who had been pursuing them. This theory was supported by the discovery of additional evidence in the surrounding forest. A search team organized by Detective Hayes found what appeared to be the remains of a campsite approximately 3 miles from the Ashford property, hidden in a grove of pine trees that provided natural concealment. The campsite showed evidence of recent use, with the remains of campfires and temporary shelters that suggested someone had been living there for an extended period. More significantly, investigators found personal items at this campsite that appeared to belong to members of the Ashford family. These included a pair of boots that matched Henry Ashford's known shoe size, a coat that neighbors identified as belonging to William, and several items of clothing that appeared to have been torn or damaged in some kind of struggle. The condition of these items suggested that they had been abandoned hastily, possibly during some kind of confrontation. The campsite itself showed signs of having been abandoned quickly, with personal belongings scattered about as if their owners had been forced to leave suddenly. Most disturbing was the discovery of what appeared to be bloodstains on several pieces of clothing, though the amount of blood was not sufficient to indicate serious injury. Detective Hayes also found evidence that the campsite had been visited by other parties after its abandonment. Footprints in the surrounding soil indicated that several different individuals had been in the area, and the systematic way in which the campsite had been searched suggested that these visits had been purposeful rather than accidental. The discovery of the campsite raised new questions about what had happened to the Ashford family. Had they fled their property and attempted to hide in the forest? Had they been pursued by those who had been threatening them? And if so, what had been the outcome of this pursuit? Attempts to answer these questions led Detective Hayes to expand his investigation beyond the immediate area. He contacted law enforcement agencies throughout New England, requesting information about any unidentified individuals who might have been found dead or injured in remote areas during the winter of 1921. He also reached out to hospitals and medical facilities, seeking records of anyone who might have been treated for injuries consistent with exposure or violence during the relevant time period. These inquiries produced several leads, but none that could be definitively connected to the Ashford family. A body had been found in the Connecticut River near Hanover in March of 1921, but it was too badly decomposed to allow for identification. A man matching Henry Ashford's description had been treated for exposure at a hospital in Vermont in February, but he had given a false name and had disappeared before he could be questioned thoroughly. Most intriguingly, several witnesses reported seeing a group of people matching the description of the Ashford family in various locations throughout New Hampshire and Vermont during February and March of 1921. However, these sightings were often contradictory and could not be verified through official records. As Detective Hayes's investigation continued through the spring and summer of 1921, the case began to attract attention beyond the local community. Newspapers throughout New England picked up the story, drawn by the mysterious circumstances of the family's disappearance and the implications of corruption and conspiracy that had emerged during the investigation. The legal firm of Whitmore and Associates found itself under scrutiny from both law enforcement and the press. While the firm denied any wrongdoing in connection with the Ashford case, their business practices came under investigation by state authorities. Several other families came forward with stories of similar harassment and intimidation, leading to a broader investigation of the firm's activities. However, the increased attention also had unintended consequences. Several key witnesses reported receiving anonymous threats, warning them to stop cooperating with the investigation. Documents related to the case began disappearing from official files, and Detective Hayes himself reported being followed by unknown individuals. The pressure to close the investigation began to mount as the case dragged on without resolution. Local officials expressed concern about the resources being devoted to a case that seemed unlikely to produce definitive answers. The state police were under pressure to reassign Detective Hayes to other cases that were considered more pressing. In September of 1921, Detective Hayes submitted a preliminary report that outlined the evidence gathered during the investigation, but stopped short of drawing definitive conclusions about what had happened to the Ashford family. The report acknowledged that while there was substantial evidence of harassment and intimidation, there was insufficient proof to support criminal charges against any specific individuals. The report also noted that despite extensive searches, no physical evidence had been found to confirm that the Ashford family had been harmed. While their disappearance remained unexplained, there was no concrete evidence of foul play that would justify continued investigation as a criminal case. However, Detective Hayes's report also included a series of recommendations for ongoing monitoring of the situation. He suggested that the case remain open pending the discovery of additional evidence, and he recommended continued surveillance of the individuals and organizations that had been connected to the harassment of the family. The case officially remained open until 1958, though active investigations ceased in 1922. Over the years, occasional reports of sightings or discoveries of potential evidence would prompt brief, renewed interest, but none of these leads ever produced conclusive results. In 1935, a construction crew working on a new highway through the White Mountains discovered what appeared to be human remains in a remote area about 15 miles from the Ashford property. The remains were too deteriorated to allow for identification, and while speculation arose about a possible connection to the missing family, no definitive link could be established. A more promising lead emerged in 1942 when a man claiming to be Edward Ashford contacted authorities in Massachusetts. The man provided details about the family's disappearance that seemed consistent with the known evidence, and he claimed that the family had successfully escaped their pursuers and had been living under assumed names for more than 20 years. However, when investigators attempted to verify this man's identity, they found inconsistencies in his story that cast doubt on his claims. He was unable to provide satisfactory proof of his identity, and several details of his account contradicted evidence that had been gathered during the original investigation. The man eventually disappeared before he could be questioned further, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. The legal firm of Whitmore and Associates was eventually dissolved in 1924 following a series of investigations into their business practices. Several of the firm's partners were found guilty of various forms of legal misconduct, though none were ever directly connected to the Ashford case. The firm's records, which might have provided additional insight into their dealings with the family, were reportedly destroyed during the legal proceedings. The Ashford property itself remained abandoned for several years following the family's disappearance. The local authorities attempted to maintain the buildings, but without proper care, the homestead gradually fell into disrepair. By the late 1920s, the house had become structurally unsound, and the outbuildings had begun to collapse. In 1929, the property was sold at auction to settle outstanding tax obligations. The new owner, a lumber company based in Massachusetts, had no interest in preserving the homestead, and demolished the remaining structures to harvest the timber on the property. Today, only the stone foundation of the original house remains visible, largely overgrown by forest vegetation. The fate of the Ashford family remains one of New Hampshire's most enduring mysteries. Over the decades, numerous theories have been proposed to explain their disappearance, ranging from voluntary relocation to escape financial difficulties, to death at the hands of those who had been threatening them. However, despite the passage of more than a century, no definitive evidence has emerged to resolve the case conclusively. Local historians and researchers continue to study the case, drawn by the complex web of financial intrigue, legal corruption, and family tragedy that characterized the events of 1921. Some believe that the truth about what happened to the Ashford family may still be discoverable through careful analysis of existing evidence or the potential discovery of new documentary sources. Others argue that the case represents a broader pattern of abuse and exploitation that characterized the treatment of rural families by powerful legal and financial interests during the early 20th century. From this perspective, the Ashford case is significant, not only for its specific details, but as an example of the vulnerability of isolated communities to predatory practices. The conspiracy theory that emerged around the case has persisted and evolved over the years, taking on a life of its own that extends far beyond the known facts. Some versions of the theory suggest that the Ashford family discovered evidence of illegal activities by the legal firm and were eliminated to prevent them from exposing these crimes. Others propose that the family was involved in some kind of resistance movement against corrupt legal practices and were targeted for assassination. More elaborate versions of the conspiracy theory connect the Ashford case to broader patterns of corruption and cover-ups involving state and federal authorities. These theories suggest that the investigation was deliberately sabotaged to protect powerful interests, and that evidence of the family's fate was systematically suppressed to prevent exposure of a larger conspiracy. While these conspiracy theories lack concrete supporting evidence, they continue to attract believers who see in the Ashford case a symbol of the struggle between ordinary people and powerful institutions. The case has been featured in numerous books, articles, and documentaries that explore both the known facts and the various theories that have emerged to explain the family's disappearance. In recent decades, advances in forensic science have led to renewed interest in the case. DNA analysis techniques that were not available during the original investigation could potentially provide new insights if physical evidence were discovered. Ground-penetrating radar and other modern archaeological methods could be used to conduct more thorough searches of areas that might contain human remains. However, the passage of time has made such investigations increasingly difficult. The original crime scene has been completely destroyed, and many of the individuals who might have had knowledge of the events are no longer alive. Documentary evidence has been scattered or lost, and the institutional memory of the case has faded. The legal precedents established during the investigation of the Ashford case had lasting implications for how similar cases were handled in subsequent decades. The case highlighted the need for better regulation of legal and financial firms that dealt with rural properties, and it contributed to reforms in debt collection practices that provided greater protection for property owners. The case also demonstrated the challenges faced by law enforcement agencies when investigating cases that involved powerful interests with the resources to resist scrutiny. The reported intimidation of witnesses and the disappearance of evidence became part of the case study used in training programs for investigators dealing with similar situations. Despite the lack of resolution, the Ashford case remains relevant to contemporary discussions about justice, corruption, and the protection of vulnerable communities. The questions raised by the case about the abuse of legal processes and the exploitation of isolated families continue to resonate in modern contexts where similar dynamics might still be at play. The story of the Ashford family serves as a reminder of the importance of maintaining vigilance against the abuse of power and the need for robust institutions that can protect ordinary people from predatory practices. While the specific fate of Thomas, Margaret, William, Edward, and Henry Ashford may never be known, their story continues to serve as a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked authority and the vulnerability of those who lack the resources to defend themselves. The abandoned foundation stones that mark the former location of the Ashford homestead have become a pilgrimage site for those interested in the case. Visitors often leave flowers or other tokens of remembrance, and the site has been marked with a small plaque that acknowledges the family's disappearance and the ongoing mystery surrounding their fate. Local folklore has grown up around the site, with stories of strange sounds and unexplained phenomena reported by visitors over the years. While these reports are almost certainly the product of suggestion and the human tendency to find mystery in isolated places, they contribute to the enduring fascination with the case and help to keep the memory of the Ashford family alive. The case has also inspired works of fiction that use the known facts as the basis for imaginative reconstructions of what might have happened to the family. These fictional treatments often explore themes of justice, family loyalty, and the cost of resistance to authority that resonate with the documented aspects of the case. Academic researchers continue to study the case as an example of the social and economic pressures that affected rural communities during the early 20th century. The documentation that survived from the investigation provides valuable insights into the legal and financial practices of the period, as well as the challenges faced by families trying to maintain their independence in an increasingly complex economic environment. The Ashford case also serves as a case study in the limitations of historical investigation. Despite extensive documentation and thorough investigation at the time, many crucial questions remain unanswered. The case demonstrates how the passage of time, the destruction of evidence, and the death of witnesses can make it impossible to achieve complete understanding of historical events, no matter how thoroughly they were investigated initially. Perhaps most significantly, the case raises ongoing questions about the nature of truth and justice in cases where powerful interests conflict with the rights of individuals. The failure to achieve definitive resolution in the Ashford case reflects broader challenges in ensuring accountability when those responsible for wrongdoing have the resources and influence to avoid consequences. The legacy of the Ashford family extends beyond the specific circumstances of their disappearance to encompass larger questions about power, justice, and the protection of the vulnerable. Their story continues to serve as a reminder that the pursuit of truth and justice is often complicated by forces that prefer that certain truths remain hidden. As we reflect on the events of that winter in 1921, we are left with more questions than answers. What exactly happened to the Ashford family during those final weeks in January? Were they able to escape the threats that had driven them from their home, or did they fall victim to those who had been pursuing them? And perhaps most troubling of all, were there others who knew the truth but chose to remain silent rather than risk becoming targets themselves? The mountain forests of New Hampshire have kept their secrets for more than a century now, and the voices that might have provided answers have long since been silenced by time. Yet the questions raised by the Ashford case continue to echo through the years, reminding us that some mysteries may be too dangerous to solve completely, and that some truths may be too powerful to emerge fully into the light. In the end, the story of the Ashford family stands as a testament to the courage of those who resist injustice, even when the cost of that resistance may be everything they hold dear. Whether they found the freedom and safety they sought, or whether they paid the ultimate price for their defiance, their legacy serves as a reminder that the struggle for justice is often carried out by ordinary people in extraordinary circumstances, far from the attention of history, in places where the only witnesses are the wind and the trees.